Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this week's Philosophy of Physics seminar. Today we have George Webster talking to us. George did his DPhil here, finishing a couple of years ago, under the supervision of Adrian Moore and yours truly. And the thesis was on ontic structural realism and the philosophy of Deleuze, which was super interesting and novel and unexpected. But since then, George has been turning to lots of issues in the foundations of quantum mechanics, looking a lot at cubism, phenomenology, and the foundations of quantum mechanics. And this is kind of in the same kind of big research project, I guess. So this is Wheeler on it from bit as a critical idealist proposal. So thanks so much for talking, George, and over to you.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you so much. It's really, I'm really happy to sort of be able to be here and take some of these ideas for a walk with you and to sort of glean and farm whatever sort of wisdom I can in the discussion. And for context, James was a supervisor for my DPhil, so you know where to direct any complaints, I suppose. So, okay. And Adam was my internal examiner, actually, so won't let you get off the hook. Great. So, I'm going to be talking about John Wheeler's sort of famous or infamous it from bit proposal. For those of you who aren't so familiar with this, here are the sort of main passages in which he sort of articulates this proposal, or sort of sums it up at least, taken from a 1989 paper of his. So he sort of declares it from bit. Otherwise put, every particle, every field, force, even the space-time continuum itself, derives its function, its meaning, its very existence entirely, even if in some contexts indirectly, from the apparatus elicited answers to yes or no questions, binary choices, or bits. And then he continues sort of immediately on the next page. It from bit symbolizes the idea that every item of the physical world has at bottom, a very deep bottom in most instances, an immaterial source and explanation. What we call reality arises in the last analysis from the posing of yes-no questions and the registering of equipment-evoked responses. In short, that all things physical are information theoretic in origin, and this is a participatory universe. Wow. So, John Wheeler, obviously a very famous sort of physicist and quantum information theorist, and this it from bit thesis, I suppose, is not sort of without influence in the physics community. So, no delay. So Mark Feely, in an edited collection out of the Foundational Questions Institute, that I'll talk a bit more about in a second, tells us that claims that it from bit effectively captures the zeitgeist of post-quantum physics. So possibly that's an exaggeration, but even so, we can see the influence of Wheeler's thought on prominent Nobel Prize-winning physicists like Anton Zeilinger, who tells us that the distinction between reality and our knowledge of reality, between reality and information, cannot be made. So it from bit enjoys at least some influence in the physics community. And even then, I think there's this sort of broad cultural awareness of this idea. So, if anyone, like a layperson, is sort of half interested in sort of physics and computer science and the sciences in general, this sort of radical, sexy claim about information and physical reality is probably going to pop up on like their YouTube suggestions and things like that. And I suppose it's sort of part of what motivates as well a kind of generalized excitement about quantum information theory. The idea that it issues in these radical, seemingly sort of ultimate claims about reality. But the problem here is that it's not at all precisely obvious what it from bit is supposed to be telling us, right? What precisely does information mean here? And what is this exact sort of nature of a relationship to physical reality that's being proposed? And this problem's exacerbated by Wheeler's sort of quite enigmatic style of expressing himself. Or as this random person on Blue Sky tells us, look, Wheeler was a brilliant physicist, but I just read the famous it from bit essay, and it's quite the hot jumbled mess. think you should also always start by researching your topic on social media. That's really good to get the impact or something. I don't know. So though this person clearly isn't mincing their words, I'm sure the sort of sentiments expressed here are kind of familiar enough to anyone who's sort of read this essay. Wheeler does have this quite enigmatic way of expressing himself.
Is that one like since September 2023?
It very well, possibly is. I think I screenshotted this sort of a couple of weeks ago, so yeah. And that is not me, by the way. If it was me, it would be sort of a red colourful heart or something. Well, maybe he's going to get more likes now. So yeah, evidently sort of Wheeler does sort of express himself quite enigmatically, right? His writing sort of punctuated by these aphoristic phrases, the meaning of which is not entirely sort of immediately obvious. The boundary of the boundary is zero. The super Copernican principle, more is different, and so on. So reading Wheeler will feel a bit more like reading Nietzsche all the time than reading anyone who's sort of out of or in or trying to emulate the kind of writing values of the analytic tradition. So yeah, we've got this sort of thesis, it from bit, that seems to be proposing this sort of sexy, radical claim about the nature of physical reality and information. But we have this problem of sort of insufficient precision and that's made worse by the sort of enigmatic style of writing. And all this is to say that this proposal and this sort of, feature of the sort of intellectual community of physics is sort of is ripe for philosophical analysis. Unfortunately, and that's what. It's sort of this variable. The delay is variable, so it's hard to sort of predict and follow the rhythm. Speed of light was supposed to be constant. And it's just unfortunate that there doesn't seem to be much in the way of philosophical analysis of these ideas. So as far as I can tell, there's really only sort of prominently Chris's book on quantum information theory and this collected volume that's sort of issued out of the Foundational Questions Institute that I believe was produced off the back of an essay competition or something. And that's where the Mark Feely sort of contribution from before is cited from. So what I'm interested in doing today is sort of offering a way of thinking about and understanding and trying to make sense of this it from bit proposal. And importantly, I want to try and do that in a way that sort of offers a bit of an alternative interpretation to the one that's sort of implicit in most of the essays in this volume and made explicit and critiqued by Chris in his book. So to lend a bit more sort of specificity here, Wheeler's sort of typically read quite literally as advancing something like a form of Berkeleyan idealism. So it from bit here means something along the lines of physical reality just is, or is reducible to, information understood as some sort of material, mental stuff. And I'll turn to sort of Chris's critique of this view in a moment. But what I'm interested in doing is sort of reading it from bit as expressing a claim in the Copernican sort of revolutionary spirit of Kant. So not so much that physical reality literally is or is reducible to information, but that the objects of scientific experience or cognition are conditioned by certain functions of thought or functions of the mind. And I'm going to try and do this by drawing on and applying work done by Ernst Cassirer. So Cassirer's this neo-Kantian philosopher and philosopher of science and physics, who's sort of arguably been a bit hard done by the history of philosophy. So, as an overview, in 1910, he publishes one of his first big books, Substance and Function, which studies and details the sort of philosophical implications of mathematics, physics, and chemistry. In 1921, he publishes an extended essay on Einstein's theory of relativity. And in 1936 is when he publishes his book on quantum theory, determinism and indeterminism in modern physics. So I suppose if you're interested in publishing a book on quantum theory and you want that book to gain loads of traction and loads of interesting attention, 1936 probably isn't the best year to do it. There are sort of other events brewing in Europe at the time that are a bit more distracting. And also, the book was published in German, but in Sweden, sort of after Cassirer emigrates from Germany, from Hamburg in 1933. And so that will obviously have sort of contributed to the sort of lack of wide reception or impact it had at the time. But his philosophy of quantum theory, this book in particular, remains sort of pretty understudied to this day. So yes, people like Michael Friedman work and talk about Cassirer, but in his Dynamics of Reason book, for example, he just doesn't reference or talk about Cassirer's account of quantum theory. And likewise, though you see sort of Cassirer quite prominently positioned at the start of at least one of James Ladyman's and Stephen French's sort of 2003 structural realist papers. And they even do sort of reference and talk about this book a little bit, I guess. They're really, really selective with their engagement with Cassirer, and they set about trying to extract Cassirer sort of pretty immediately from his sort of neo-Kantian philosophical framework in which he's operating. They literally, I don't have the passage up here, but they literally say oh, Cassirer thought this stuff. What if you could just jettison all the neo-Kantian stuff or something like that? So it's Cassirer, but not really Cassirer, not really on Cassirer's terms. And that all seems to be a bit of a shame, because Cassirer's this philosopher who really seriously engages with quantum theory. He's engaging with it basically at the time when these developments are happening, or when they're sort of settling into place a bit. And he was actually in touch with a lot of key physicists from this time. So he exchanged letters with Max Born, with Einstein, with Heisenberg. Einstein read his essay, his extended essay on relativity, and gave comments before its publication. And in the preface, Cassirer sort of thanks him for that. And Einstein actually read and sort of praised and valued the quantum theory book as well. And Cassirer actually discussed the manuscript for his quantum theory book in person with Schrödinger in Oxford and with Niels Bohr in Copenhagen before it was published. So one can only assume that there was some sort of informative discussion there. So we've got this philosopher who was there, who was sort of plugged into the physics community, who produced this account of quantum mechanics that marries a detailed study of the relevant physics, a close discussion with lots of relevant physicists, with this sort of distinctive neo-Kantian philosophical framework that certainly seems sort of worth studying or interesting in some way. And outside of the context of a philosophy of physics, there does seem to be this sort of generalized Cassirer renaissance going on, sort of headed by people like Samantha Mathern. There's more and more work appearing on Cassirer, and I suppose I see part of the point of this project is to sort of promote that renaissance a bit in the context of a philosophy of physics. So to sort of summarize what I'm trying to do, or what I'm trying to sort of contribute to the world in the context of this paper, I'm wanting to sort of map out this distinctive alternative reading of Wheeler's It from Bit proposal. I'm going to suggest that this alternative allows us to extract a more sort of defensible insight from his remarks, which I guess we'll see in a moment, admittedly, isn't the hardest thing to do, given what informational immaterialism looks like. And in places, I'm going to sort of extend a sort of Cassirer-inspired critique or corrective to Wheeler. So the idea here is going to be that the sort of critical idealism of Cassirer certainly fits with the spirit of the It from Bit thesis and with much of its letter, but there'll be these cases where you can sort of Wheeler's sort of expressing himself in a way that's unavoidably sort of in this sort of Berkeleyan idealist line. And I'm going to say that Cassir gives us some resources to say why he shouldn't be doing that and to sort of provide a corrective to get his view back on track. So that's for conceptual aims. The historical aims, if you like to carve things up that way, just going to be to extend sort of a version of this neo-Kantian philosophical framework into quantum information theory, which I don't think is something that's been sort of articulated or done just yet. Again, to sort of promote and try to do greater justice to Cassir's philosophy of physics, and I suppose in doing so, to try and say something illuminating about what's going on in Cassir's thought. Good, and so the plan of action is going to, there's no delay now, it's brilliant. So the plan of action is going to be to talk a bit about the sort of more literal reading of It from Bit, and how that's presented in Chris's book, talk about Chris's critique of it, and then move on to provide a sort of snapshot of the critical idealist neo-Kantian framework. I'll then talk about Cassir's engagement with quantum theory and sort of the basic message of his determinism and indeterminism book. And then I'll try and put Cassir into contact with Wheeler. Okay, so let's return to Wheeler just for a second. So on the face of it, we can see why anyone is going to be tempted to read Wheeler as advocating some form of Berkeley-style idealism, right? He literally claims that the physical world has an immaterial source and explanation. And so reasonably enough, this is how Chris presents Wheeler's view in his book. He tells us that we can call this kind of view, which would do away with material items like particles and fields at the fundamental level, and replace them with an immaterial basis of information, informational immaterialism. And this is going to be a view according to which pieces of information are the sort of newfangled correlates of sense data, Berkeleyan ideas in the mind, in the modern dress of the latest theory. But there are sort of two major problems with this view, or equivocations going on within this view that Chris identifies for us. So the first is a confusion between two notions of information, right? So there's this ordinary everyday sense of information that we're walking around with, and then this technical sense of information that's employed in information theory and with some modification, I suppose, in quantum information theory. So in the everyday context, we tend to understand by information just something like semantic or epistemic or sort of representational content, right? Ideas. And this seems to be the notion that's employed by Wheeler in his sort of ultimate claim, in his It from Bit thesis. But that's not the notion that's used in the science that he's sort of drawing that thesis from. So it's not the same thing as the technical sense of information that's used in quantum information theory. And that's because information in this sense just means something like some physically defined quantity. Or, so we can get more specific here if you want. So Chris defines quite precisely information in the technical sense, information T, sorry, I should have explained that subscript, as what is produced by an technical information source that is required to be reproducible at the destination if the transmission is to be counted a success. But I don't think you really have to get all that specific to sort of get the claim that these two notions of information don't have much to do with one another. So as Chris tells us, in fact, so pieces of information just are not at all the right kinds of things to be the modernized correlates of mental items from which an immaterial world might be constructed. So information in the technical sense just doesn't have the sort of mental ideally connotations or associations that's required by informational immaterialism. So that's the first problem or equivocation with this view that we can, in the first instance, take Wheeler to be presenting. The second is a more sort of logic-y, grammatically sort of point. And that's to do with the confusion between tokens and types. So if you take an abstract noun, for example, like leisure, this is a type that on the face of it doesn't seem to have any sort of material, spatiotemporal existence or basis. But leisure, there being leisure, sort of depends on the existence of, or has to be realised by, all these different leisurely things and events, right? This is my take on what a life of leisure looks like. A life of leisure, sort of in the abstract, a life of leisure has to be encoded in and manifested within all sorts of concrete leisurely activities. Avocado. And so Chris's line of argument is going to be that in much the same way, information is an abstract noun. And that equally depends on, or must be realised in, or manifest through concrete particular things, right? Information is encoded in arrangements in concrete physical things. And the materiality or immateriality of these concrete particular things is just a completely independent question. So again, as Chris tells us, pieces of information are abstracter. To be realised, they will need to be instantiated by some particular token or other. And what will such tokens be? Unless one is already committed to immaterialism for some reason, and this is my favourite bit of your entire book, Chris. And let me not be coy, there can be no good reason why one would be. Brilliant. Never be coy. These tokens will be material physical things. So that's the critique of informational immaterialism. It's just not the view it thinks it is, or that it's trying to be, right? Because it confuses two important distinctions. One between different senses of information, and another between types and tokens. And I really like this critique. I think it's cool, it's clean, and I don't really have a bad thing to say about it. What I'm wanting to do, or what I'm interested in doing, is exploring whether there might be a different interpretation or a different reading of Wheeler's underlying position. So what I want to do is explore whether there might be this sort of interesting alternative in the form of a kind of critical idealist rethinking of what Wheeler's up to and what he's trying to express. And again, this is because I'm interested in sort of shedding more light on and trying to sort of understand Cassir's thought myself, and because it seems as though there might be a legitimate sort of alternative interpretation, one that's sort of not been recognised or articulated yet, and that's philosophically interesting, at least because it's more sophisticated and defensible than your sort of Berkeleyan idealism, or than informational immaterialism. Also, I suppose that there's a weak claim here about sort of generosity or charitability in our sort of reading of Wheeler. So I've not encountered too much of a reason to think that Wheeler was kind of systematically, philosophically trained. And, you know, if you've got a student who is coming up with some pretty sort of radical, wacky material, like, yeah, maybe you're going to sort of show them the certain sort of incoherences that are sort of within that view, but you're going to try and bring to them certain distinctions that they might not have had access to yet. And see, oh, well, given those distinctions, do you still think that? Or do you think something like Cassir's critical idealism or something? Is that how I do it, Diana? You're, sorry, one of my undergraduate students. So I hope I'm more of a nicey, you know, one than just demolishing. Okay. Right, so let's give a bit of a snapshot now of sort of Cassir's critical idealist framework. So Cassir's a transcendental philosopher in the Marburg neo-Kantian tradition. So, like Kant, he's interested in excavating and identifying the underlying conditions for the possibility of experience. But there are a few important ways in which Kant sort of updated for Cassir, by Cassir, and other Marburg neo-Kantians. And I'll just mention sort of two of those ways that I think are relevant here. So the first is that plausibly Kant's interested in determining the conditions for the possibility of my experience, or of the experience of, the empirical experience of an agent. Whereas Cassirer really sort of broadens this notion of experience to encompass something like scientific and mathematical experience, or scientific and mathematical cognition, as well as other sorts of sort of cultural experience. They will include things like aesthetics and ethics and stuff like that. So when we're talking about Cassirer's philosophy of science, the experience that we're talking about is something like a perspective that's sort of immanent to the body of scientific cognition itself, not the experience of any individual scientific practitioner. And second, and relatedly, Cassirer acknowledges, right, a key difference, sort of famously, between the Marburg Neo-Kantians and Kant, is that Cassirer, being one of them, acknowledges this sort of historically dynamic character of the sciences and theory change in a way that Kant just doesn't. So for Kant, it's, Newton and Euclid, like necessarily, universally, always the perfect truth. Whereas for Cassirer, the facts of scientific experience that he's interested in explaining the conditions for the possibility of are subject to change. And therefore, so is his account of those conditions. Okay, so those are sort of some of the main relevant differences between Cassirer and Kant. Cassirer expresses his version of critical idealism in terms of this distinction between substance and function. So this is sort of underlying a lot of his work sort of continuously throughout his philosophical career. Now, this distinction sort of like cuts across various logical, epistemological, and metaphysical dimensions. But broadly speaking, a substance-based sort of philosophical view for Cassirer is one according to which thought is just in the business of representing or copying mind-independent objects or substances. And a function-based view is one according to which the objects of experience, is one according to which the objects of experience conform to the functions of thought or of cognition. And surprise, surprise, Cassirer is going to want to argue that we should be adopting and endorsing a function-based view over a substance-based view. So a large part of his motivation for this sort of view, for this sort of function-based critical idealism, comes from his philosophy of mathematics, actually. And he adopts this view that is often described as a form of logical structuralism that he thinks makes best sense out of developments in the 19th and early 20th century of number theory and geometry. And according to this view, the objects of mathematical experience are these sort of ideal structures that are generated by underlying logical functions or relationships. And he draws on, well, a few people in his Substance of Function, but prominently Richard Dedekind. And, for example, so Cassirer argues, drawing on sort of some of Dedekind's ideas, that the natural numbers, for example, can be understood as just sort of positions in this ideal structure that's generated by a continuing sort of repeated series of transitive and asymmetrical logical relations. And you might think here, right, well that's fine-ish, I suppose. Like that seems like a reasonably sort of intelligible view in the domain of mathematics. But it certainly seems as though in the natural sciences, we're in the business of representing mind-independent natural facts. But even here, Cassirer is going to argue that a function-based critical idealism best reflects the actual practice of the actual practices of science. And he appeals here to various sort of what we can consider to be the elementary units of scientific experience or cognition, measurements. So, substance and function. So his book, Substance and Function, is riddled with all sorts of these examples. But one of the more transparent is his treatment of the measurement of temperature. And Pierre de Hem is a relevant figure who's in the background here for Cassir, who's sort of explicitly cited. And the idea here is going to be that a measurement statement like, it's 20 degrees Celsius in here, just can't be a transparent observation of a natural fact. And that's because in order to assign the relevant numerical values in the first place, we need to refer to some account of the proportional relationship between temperature and the volume of mercury in our thermometer or something like that. So as Cassir tells us, in order even to establish the schema of measurement, we're obliged to pass from the subjective perception of an object, from the subjective perception to an objective functional correlation between heat and extension. In this example, we see how the simple quantitative determination of a physical fact draws it into a network of theoretical presuppositions. So the very possibility of a precise measurement of temperature, beyond just feeling heat qualitatively, depends for Cassir on a kind of prior conceptual ordering of one's experience. And Cassir is going to say that this dependence on a prior conceptual ordering is exhibited in all these particular cases of measurement that he looks at. And he's going to say that this prior sort of conditioning generalizes to all scientific knowledge and inquiry. So because even these most elementary sort of experimental results presuppose some system of theoretical functions and concepts, Cassir thinks that no scientific concept or principle can be acquired in isolation. There's always some underlying theoretical functional relationship, or what Cassir elsewhere calls invariant relation, undergirding and making scientific experience possible. And it's for this reason that Cassir tasks the philosopher with uncovering and identifying this sort of system of functions or invariant relations. So he tells us that the critical theory of experience would constitute the universal invariant theory of experience. And in fact, it's this project of uncovering these invariant relations and the invariant relations that undergird those invariant relations that Cassir thinks defines the very notion of scientific objectivity in the first place. So he tells us that we do not know objects as if they were independently determined and given as objects, but we know objectively by producing certain limitations and by fixing certain permanent elements and connections within the uniform flow of experience. So objectivity for Cassir isn't a matter of capturing or reflecting the world as it is in itself, extracted from or independent of our sort of subjective mess. It's a matter of providing statements of measurement, laws and principles that are maximally systematic and coherent. And scientists and philosophers, on his view, are engaged in this game of identifying, describing, and improving upon that systematicity and coherence. And they do this by recognizing and articulating all these invariant functional relationships. So Cassir's work is quite expansive, and there are lots of different sort of detailed, nitty-gritty levels to his account of these invariants. And this project is sort of necessarily open-ended and responsive to revision, right? Because again, he sort of embraces the kind of historically dynamic character of the history of science. But here's at least some indication of the structure of scientific and philosophical inquiry on his account. This isn't anything that's sort of presented in Cassir, like all his work isn't, I mean, there's a systematicity to it, but you never see something like a neat table of categories for him like you would see in the Critique of Pure Reason or anything like that. So this is borrowed and adapted from a really helpful paper that I found by Jeremy Heiss. And so the transcendental philosopher for Cassir is wanting to articulate all of these different invariant concepts or relations that are at different levels of generality. But they're also uniquely concerned with these ultimately general conditions for the possibility not of sort of some particular scientific measurement experience, but of scientific cognition at all. So things like the principle of causality and certain principles to do with theory selection and the assumption that nature is unified, he just thinks are kind of conditions without which you just couldn't have scientific cognition. So the reason I've starred role and scope here is because there is some sort of internal controversy within the Cassir scholarship as to what invariance categories concepts have what role and what scope, and whether there's any kind of inconsistency here. Whether there's any kind of inconsistency here. And I'm afraid I haven't deliberated too much on these issues just yet. I've been more concerned with leveraging the sort of broader encounter with Wheeler. But I don't think the story that I'm telling relies overly on material in Cassir that's sort of too dodgy or controversial. So we'll see in a moment when we talk about Cassir on quantum theory that I'm drawing quite heavily on his account of causality as this sort of absolute regulative principle. And I don't think there's anyone that is disagreeing that that's there in the text, or that's part of Cassir's view. And I suppose anyway, even if there are details to be worked out here with respect to the sort of relative, with respect to the respective sort of scopes and roles of all these sort of invariants and categories, I still think it's plausible to suggest that critical idealism is at least not as incoherent and unattractive in the way that informational immaterialism that Chris showed us obviously is, right? There may be details to be worked out, but even that's not the case for informational immaterialism. Okay, so that's sort of contextual snapshot of the critical idealist framework that Cassir is working with. And so now I'll say something about Cassir's book on quantum theory, and then we'll try and focus into contact with the Wheeler stuff. So Cassir frames his book and his engagement with quantum mechanics in terms of this supposed skepticism that the theory generates for causality. So it's explicitly subtitled Historical and Systematic Studies of the Problem of Causality. And he cites Heisenberg's claim that the invalidity of the causal law is definitely established by quantum mechanics to this effect. And not that I need to repeat this here, but the idea being that at least at the level of the individual electron or photon or whatever, we can't offer a completely deterministic story of what's going on, right? The quantum mechanical descriptions might seem to be incomplete in that respect. And Cassir is going to challenge this skeptical concern first by clarifying how we should be thinking about causality. And second, by claiming that the real lesson of quantum mechanics is a revised conception of the notion of a physical state. So, talking about causality first. Casey distinguishes between a metaphysical and a regulative or critical principle of causality. The metaphysical concept just puts causality in the world and conceives of this entirely determinate causal order that's grounded in the sort of completely determined nature of things. The critical concept, which Casey derives in no small part from his engagements with people like Hume and Kant, and in particular with Helmholtz, just sees causality as this regulative and methodological demand on science, on scientific cognition. As we saw in that table before, it provides this sort of ultimate condition for the possibility of scientific experience to take place in the first place. And it's just understood more broadly as a general requirement for the conformity to law of our scientific statements. So as Casey tells us, the causal principle is an assertion and prescription as to how we should grasp and form our empirical concepts. Or as he says in a little bit more detail, the causal principle is... Come on, catch up. The causal principle is a statement about measurements, laws, and principles. It says that these can be so... It says that all of these can be so related and combined with one another that from this combination there results a system of physical knowledge and not just a mere aggregate of isolated observations. So this conception of causality is intimately bound up with the other regulative requirements that scientific that sort of identifies. That scientific cognition aim towards unity, generality, and systematicity. And again, this structure is just what makes science possible for Casey. And what he's going to do, he's going to claim that the skeptical concerns about metaphysical causality aside, that none of our revolutionary physicists abandons this project of producing physical statements that conform to law. So he tells us that none of these revolutionaries wanted to dispense altogether with their actual physical procedure with conformity to law of events. Rather, they ask how they may express and establish this conformity unobjectionably under the conditions of our observation of nature. So the question or concern for Casey isn't about causality. If we're good critical idealists, on his view, then we're just not going to endorse the metaphysical notion that's challenged by quantum mechanics in the first place. The difficulty is reckoning with the implications of the theory regarding what it is that conforms to our causal principle. So if scientific cognition must be formed or structured in a way that conforms to causal law, and if quantum theory meets that requirement, what are the implications going to be for the contents of that cognition? That's the sort of problem space that Casey is operating in. And the implication here is going to be, on Casey's account, a reconceptualization of the notion of the physical state. So in other words, quantum theory for Casey affects this shift from the classical notion of the physical state as a completely determined or determinable individual to a notion of physical state that's dictated by various conditions for the observability of quantum phenomena. And the uncertainty relations and superposition are key examples that Casey references and draws on here. So I can't have a completely determinate knowledge or story of a single electron or I may not be able to predict its future causal story. But for Cassir, a sufficient number of repeated compatible observations, through a sufficient number of repeated compatible observations, I can determine the proportions of electrons that are going to follow certain paths. And it's that kind of statistical constellation of relationships, or this idea that the physical state is constituted by a definite aggregate of relations and consists in this aggregate, that Cassir is going to take to be definitive of a new notion of quantum state. So you might sort of see here that Cassir hews really closely to Dirac's textbook presentation of quantum mechanics. And Cassir engages with and quotes Dirac like quite at length. So he says that, him citing Dirac, when an observation is made on any atomic system, the result will not in general be determinate. That is, if the experiment is repeated several times under identical conditions, several different results may be obtained. If the experiment is repeated a large number of times, it will be found that each particular result will be obtained a definite fraction of the total times. And it's this statistical probabilistic determinacy that allows us to leverage the theory to make such, accurate, brilliant predictions. So Cassir is really, just really embracing sort of Dirac's textbook presentation of the theory here. And there's sort of there's quite an irony here as well, I suppose. Dirac, from what I can tell, famously had a reputation for being quite disinterested in philosophical issues concerning quantum foundations. And in a paper of his that's collected in a sort of tribute volume to him, he tells us that, he writes that the interpretation of quantum mechanics has been dealt with by many authors, and I do not want to discuss it here. I want to deal with more fundamental things. So yeah, he's quite disinterested in, or even dismissive of, philosophical questions about quantum mechanics, right? He's more interested in developing this appropriate sort of symbolic language for the theory and sort of just getting on with the physics, I suppose. And then I guess the irony is that Cassir is going to come along and say, oh, well done, Dirac. You've kind of recognised and described and resolved the basic conceptual puzzle of quantum mechanics. And again, this is because, and this is the case because on Cassir's account, all we're wanting to do is sort of configure and cohere our concepts, and the ultimate functions that condition the possibility of scientific cognition. Incidentally, I don't know if there's any sort of direct or indirect transcendental philosophical influences on Dirac in the way that there arguably are with Bohr. If there are, that'd be really interesting to find out. Okay, so this is how Cassir sums things up for us. So he tells us that the abandonment of absolute determination at the level of their sort of individual classical object restores the highest degree of relative determination of which physical knowledge is capable. When a maximum observation of a physical system is made, its subsequent state is completely determined by the result of this observation. And this principle can be used as the axiom to express what we are to regard as the state of a system in the sense of atomic physics. So the notion of the physical state becomes this statistical structure or aggregate of relations. You can see why the structural realists really like this idea. There's aggregate relations of compatible measurements that are perfectly reasonably, if only statistically, determinable in the way required by this general regulative demand of conformity to law. And as Cassir emphasizes at the start of his book, these two, the principle of causality and the nature of an object or a physical state, are intimately interconnected and mutually determine one another. Although, admittedly, in this case, the determination seems to be very one-directional. It doesn't seem to be particularly mutual. So causality is this ultimate regulative principle, and our conception of the object just conforms to that methodological requirement. Okay, so that's some picture of the general critical idealist framework and Cassir's engagement with quantum theory. Now I'm going to sort of try and put this into contact with Wheeler. So I claimed that critical idealism captures the spirit of the it from bit thesis, which is just the idea that, and by that I mean just the idea that physical reality, or what we call physical reality, has something to do with us, right? And I think that's pretty straightforwardly the case. That's it from bit is the spirit of the it from bit thesis is in keeping with the critical idealist framework, or vice versa. And similarly, it seems to be the case that a critical idealist framework fits quite naturally with much of a letter of Wheeler's remarks. So this language of derives its function, well, function is quite a happy linguistic accident, but derives its function from its meaning, its very existence entirely, the notion of an immaterial source and explanation, what we call reality, the notion that reality is participatory, all that I think is pretty amenable to this sort of critical idealist interpretation. But there are these moments when Wheeler just can't help but be interpreted along the lines of some Berkeley-style idealism. And in these cases, I think Cassir gives us some resources to critique and correct Wheeler in these moments. So an example that appears earlier on in Wheeler's essay is that he tells us, what does he say? He's talking about photons, and he says, we know perfectly well that the photon existed neither before the emission nor after the detection. And as a kind of expansion of this idea, much later in the essay, when he runs through a sort of more explicit example, which I think is worth going through at length. So he tells us, the photon that we are going to register tonight from that 4 billion year old quasar cannot be said to have had an existence out there 3 billion years ago, or 2, when it passed an intervening gravitational lens, or 1, or even a day ago. Not until we have fixed arrangements at our telescope do we register tonight's quantum as having passed to the left or right of the lens, or by both routes, as in a double slit experiment. This registration, like every delayed choice experiment, reminds us that no elementary quantum phenomenon is a phenomenon until, in Bohr's words, it has been brought to a close by an irreversible act of amplification. What we call the past is built on bits. So, he's quite evidently here equating the existence of a photon out there with our registration of it through our measuring devices and equipment. And so, as Chris suggested earlier, this just seems to be a modernized correlate or equivalent of the Berkeleyan claim that to be is to be perceived. Right? So we can't talk about the photon can't be said to have had an existence until we register it, until we measure it. And even further than that, Wheeler seems to be claiming not only that the photon pops into existence only when measured, but also that its multi-billion year history does too. So it's only when I measure it here and now that it becomes the case that it existed 4 billion years ago. And that's what I take to be expressed by this sort of famous U-circuit diagram thing that we get from Wheeler. This isn't Wheeler's version. This is a prettier version. So you've got the history of the universe that's somehow leading up to the emergence of conscious life for observers. And it's only on observation of the sort of present evidence that history comes into existence. So you need the observer to sort of complete this circuit, so to speak. Again, what we call the past is built on bits. Or as elsewhere he puts it, sort of the only evidence for the present, no, the only evidence for the past is the present, or something like that. And there he seems to be advancing this very sort of radical metaphysical claim that the past only exists once we encounter the evidence for it. Which is wild. So what's the sort of Cassirer-inspired diagnosis of this position? Based on his engagements with quantum theory and his sort of general critical idealist framework. Well, it's going to be that in each of these cases where Wheeler's presenting a view that's sort of unavoidably got this Berkeleyan metaphysical idealist tenor, that he's just falling on the wrong side of the relevant distinctions. So Wheeler's worrying about the conditions under which individual photons can be said to exist out there. So he's informed by this substance-based view, according to which our concept of a photon just reflects a mind-independent physical reality. He's concerned about the breakdown of a sort of traditional causal order because he conceives of causality as a set of relations between completely determinate things. And it's these completely determinate things, the individual photon, the photon he talks about, that he still considers to satisfy the notion of a physical object or state. And to really drive home this point, I want to sort of juxtapose these passages in which in which Wheeler and Cassirer are basically using precisely the same descriptive machinery. This descriptive language of questions and answered being issued to and from our measuring devices. I was really excited when I found this passage, and I won't admit how recently I found it. But they are basically just using the same language, right? So what we call reality arises in the last analysis from the posing of yes-no questions and the registering of equipment-evoked responses. And then, similarly, in Cassirer, the answer given to us by nature is determined not only by nature itself, but at the same time by the manner of questioning and the chosen instruments of observation. So we can approach Wheeler and Cassirer in a way as starting from the same, or at least a very similar sort of starting point or observation. Just the sheer fact that the empirical conditions of observability of quantum systems is weird and non-classical. The key difference is that Cassirer takes really seriously these sort of newfound conditions of accessibility expressed by things like the uncertainty relations, expressed by superposition. And given this background commitment to this regulative picture of causality as an ultimate condition for scientific cognition, Cassirer just wants to reconceptualize the concept of a physical state. Whereas Wheeler, on the other hand, holds fast to this quite classical picture of an object or a physical state, right? The photon, and to this metaphysical notion of causality, which presents this sort of, again, this picture of, I guess, efficient causal relations between completely determinate things, billiard balls bouncing around or something. So, of course, he's going to end up with this picture of a broken down weird causal order, according to which elements of physical reality just pop into existence when measured, as well as their billion-year history. So the trick for Cassir is going to be to recognise the metaphysical dilemma is rather a logical and epistemological one. And, I'll just interrupt myself here. And he's really sort of emphasising this kind of epistemic humility that's sort of motivating him here. So he just asks, with what justification can we presuppose such a state, an individual classical-looking state, when knowledge just lacks every access to it? And then he goes on to tell us, this time referring to the uncertainty relations as a specific example of the sort of conditions for observability that he's talking about. The uncertainty relations refer to measurements, that is, to particular forms of obtaining scientific knowledge. They're not categorical statements about the objectively real, but rather modal statements about the empirically possible, about the physically observable. So in other words, there are these functional relationships that express the conditions for the possibility of scientific cognition. That is, the conditions for the possibility of a body of scientific cognition that conforms to the regulative demands of the unity, systematicity, causality, in the sense of general conformity to law. And that's just all we can be legitimately interested in. Cool. By adopting this sort of critical idealist approach, I think we can position or advance this new or slightly different way of making sense of this very radical it from bit thesis. And I think we can do this pretty straightforwardly with much of a letter of Wheeler's essay. And in those sort of less straightforward cases, we can provide a principled sort of corrective in the direction of an account that's not as obviously incoherent or unintelligible in the way that informational immaterialism is. And it seems as though we can do this by showcasing the relevance and value of engaging with a perhaps underappreciated figure in the philosophy of physics, or at least an underappreciated dimension of his work. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.